March 7, 1945, the Rhine River, Germany. The air hung thick with cordite and smoke. The sound of distant artillery rolled across the valley like thunder over steel. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, once an industrial triumph of German engineering, now stood broken and burning, its steel ribs twisted against the grey sky. Below, the Rhine surged cold and merciless, carrying debris of a crumbling empire downstream. American soldiers, soaked in sweat and mud, stared in disbelief. Against every expectation, the bridge was still standing. Barely its wooden planks splintered, its girders riddled with holes. Yet somehow, miraculously, it held. Lieutenant Carl Timmerman of the U.S. 9th Armored Division gave the order. Crossed. The engineers followed, crawling over the shuddering framework, disarming charges under sniper fire, turning chaos into calculation. Each bolt removed, each wire cut, felt like pulling death itself apart by hand. By dusk, the unthinkable had happened. The first American troops had crossed the Rhine into Nazi Germany. The bridge was dying, but its last breath would not be surrender. It would become something else entirely, something the enemy never expected. A ruined bridge reborn as a weapon. By early 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its cataclysmic conclusion, yet it was far from over. Adolf Hitler's empire was collapsing inward, but the collapse was violent, erratic, and cruel. The Allied armies, having stormed through France and Belgium after the D-Day landings, now faced Germany's final line of defense, the River Rhine. For centuries, the Rhine had been more than a river. It was a symbol of German strength, a natural fortress, stretching nearly 800 miles from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. Its steep banks, unpredictable currents, and sheer width made it a formidable obstacle to any invading force. In March 1945, it became the last great barrier between the Western Allies and the heart of the Third Reich. On the western bank, the Allied advance was grinding through ruined towns and shattered forests. The U.S. First Army, under General Courtney Hodges, pushed eastward through the Eifel Mountains, facing sporadic but deadly German resistance. The winter had been brutal, mud, snow, and endless fatigue, but morale was high. The men could feel victory drawing near, even if the cost kept mounting. Across the river, however, Hitler's orders were absolute: no retreat, no surrender. Every bridge, every crossing point, every stretch of riverbank was to be held or destroyed. The Rhine was to become a wall of fire. The German command knew that if the Allies crossed it intact, Germany would be split in two, and the war might end within weeks. The Allies, for their part, understood this perfectly. Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force SHAEF had already planned multiple crossings, involving massive logistical coordination, but those plans required weeks of preparation, building floating pontoon bridges, stockpiling fuel, and ensuring air superiority. The expected date for a full-scale crossing was late March at the earliest, then fate intervened in early March. Reconnaissance flights revealed that several Rhine bridges, long expected to be destroyed, still appeared to be standing. Among them was the Ludendorff Bridge at Rief, a small riverside town about 20 miles south of Bonn. Built during the First World War, the bridge had been named after General Erich Ludendorff and designed for both rail and road traffic. It was an over-engineered colossus of steel, nearly 1,200 feet long, supported by massive stone towers at each end. To the Allies, its survival seemed impossible. By that point in the war, German demolition teams had already blown most major bridges across the Rhine to prevent crossings. But Remagen was different. It had been damaged, yes, but not destroyed. Reports indicated that German engineers had prepared explosive charges. Yet something had gone wrong. The possibility was electrifying. If the bridge was still usable, even for a few hours, it could give the Allies an unprecedented opportunity, a direct passage into the German interior. But no one could be certain. A bridge like Ludendorff, already crippled and likely mined, could collapse under a single misstep. On the morning of March 7th, elements of the 9th Armored Division under Major General John W. Leonard approached Remagen from the west. They were exhausted, battle-worn, and expecting another destroyed crossing. Instead, as they crested the ridgeline overlooking the town, they saw something that made them freeze. Through the haze of smoke and gunfire, the bridge still spanned the Rhine. At first, disbelief, then adrenaline. Orders crackled through the radio. The bridge is still standing. Repeat, bridge intact. It was the kind of moment that defied planning. No one had been told to seize it because no one thought it would exist. Yet there it was, a damaged, trembling lifeline stretching into enemy territory. For engineers and infantry alike, the sight meant one thing: opportunity bought with chaos. As the sun dipped low and artillery echoed across the valley, the Americans began to converge on Remagen. Tanks rolled into position. Engineers unpacked their gear. Snipers and machine gun nests barked from the far bank. The bridge loomed like a ghost from another war, a piece of the old Germany that might soon help destroy the new one. What happened next would become one of the most unexpected and daring engineering feats of the Second World War. And it all began with that single realization that the Rhine, once thought impassable, had just opened a door. The Ludendorff Bridge had been built in 1916, during the height of the First World War. Its purpose was strategic from the start. a double-track railway bridge capable of rapidly transporting troops and supplies across the Rhine. The German army, possessed with logistics and redundancy, had constructed it to withstand heavy loads and aerial bombardment, foresight that would, ironically, keep it standing nearly 3 decades later under a new war's fury. Its structure was formidable, steel trusses supported by massive stone piers, with defensive towers anchoring each end, one on the west bank in Remagen, the other in Erpel across the river. But by 1945, its military value had shifted from moving supplies to preventing movement entirely. To Hitler and his generals, every bridge over the Rhine had become a potential death trap. If the Allies could not be stopped in France, they must at least be contained east of the river. So, as Allied forces advanced, German engineers received orders to prepare demolitions on all Rhine crossings. Bridges at Cologne, Dusseldorf, and Koblenz had already been destroyed. Each detonation slowed the Allied advance by days or even weeks. Precious time for Germany's desperate counteroffensives. However, things did not go as planned. The German officer in charge of the demolition, Captain Willy Brach, commanded a mixed force of engineers, Volkssturm, militia, and a few Wehrmacht regulars. His orders were clear: blow the bridge the moment Allied armor came within range. Yet, by early March, supply shortages, broken detonators, and sabotage had left his men scrambling. The explosive charges, roughly 600 kilograms of TNT, were poorly placed, many buried in frozen mud, some even disconnected from the main wiring. Worse, Allied air attacks and artillery fire had severed parts of the ignition system. When Brach finally gave the order to detonate, the result was catastrophic for the Germans. The charges went off, but the explosions were uneven, blowing holes in the decking but leaving the main structure intact. The Ludendorff Bridge, scorched and shuddering, simply refused to die. Meanwhile, American reconnaissance patrols on the West Bank confirmed what seemed impossible: the bridge was still there. Reports raced up the chain of command from platoon leaders to General Leonard, and then to General William Hoge, commander of Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division. Hoge's reaction was immediate. Seize it out. By 1 p.m. on March 7th, American tanks from the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion rolled into Remagen under heavy small arms fire. The town's streets were narrow, filled with debris, and every window seemed to hold a rifle barrel. Yet the advance continued. The soldiers knew they were facing history. They could see the bridge through the smoke, damaged but standing, cables hanging like veins from a wounded beast. Lieutenant Carl Timmerman, a 24-year-old from Nebraska and the first American officer to reach the bridge, led the assault. His men sprinted across open ground, dodging sniper fire and falling masonry. German machine guns opened from the far bank. Artillery from Erpel's cliffs thundered down. Still, the Americans pressed on. The engineers followed, hauling demolition tools, wire cutters, and explosives of their own, not to destroy, but to preserve. They moved carefully, inch by inch, crawling beneath a steel frame, cutting away unexploded German charges. Some fuses were wet, others live. A single spark could have turned the entire bridge into a flaming crater. By 4 p.m., the first wave reached the eastern side. Against all odds, they had crossed the Rhine for the first time since Napoleon's era. An invading army had breached Germany's last natural frontier from the west. That as word spread, shock rippled through the Allied command. Eisenhower was informed that evening the impossible had happened days, even weeks, ahead of schedule. "That bridge is worth its weight in gold," he reportedly said. But the miracle was fragile. The bridge had been damaged, riddled with bullet holes and twisted steel. It groaned under the strain of tanks and trucks already moving across. Engineers worked without rest to stabilize it, shoring up the supports with timber and cable. The Rhine beneath them churned black and angry, as if it, too. Within hours, Hitler's rage reached boiling point. Furious that his army had failed to destroy the crossing, he ordered airstrikes, artillery barrages, and even V-2 rocket attacks on the bridge. The battle for Remagen was no longer just about territory. It was a contest of will, ingenuity, and survival. From that moment on, the ruined Ludendorff Bridge would serve a new purpose, not just as a path across the Rhine, but as a weapon of its own kind, a tool of war, reborn by the hands of engineers. 1. The engineering angle. Bravery measured in bolts. War is often remembered for its battles, its generals, and its bloodshed, but at Remagen, it was measured in rivets, cables, and nerve. The American engineers who crossed the Ludendorff Bridge that day did not carry rifles in their hands. They carried wire cutters and demolition pliers. Their mission was not to destroy but to preserve what destruction had already begun. The 299th Engineer Combat Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel H.C. McMahon, arrived at Remagen within hours of the crossing. The bridge groaned under every passing tank. Its trusses were cracked, deck planking shattered, and explosive charges dangled from their moorings like dead snakes. The engineers knew that one false move could detonate the remnants or collapse the weakened structure into the Rhine below. They worked methodically, often under sniper fire. Each step was deliberate, checking bolts, tightening supports, cutting wires, reinforcing joints with whatever they could find: wooden beams from nearby houses, spare steel from damaged vehicles. even parts of enemy fortifications. The bridge became a living experiment in field improvisation. By day, they repaired; by night, they reinforced. As artillery shells fell around them, the engineers turned the Ludendorff into something new, not just a crossing point, but a fortress of ingenuity. Their work allowed thousands of men and tons of armor to cross into the heart of Germany before the bridge's inevitable fall. These soldiers were not remembered for their marksmanship or valor in combat, but for their defiance of physics itself. Theirs was a war of geometry and endurance, fought with spanners and sweat against the most relentless enemy of all time. 2. The tactical angle. The seizure that shouldn't have happened from a tactical perspective. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was an accident turned into advantage. No high command had planned it. No operation had been drawn. The 9th Armored Division was supposed to halt west of the Rhine, regroup, and await orders. Instead, instinct overrode instruction. When Lieutenant Karl Timmermann and his men spotted the bridge intact, he made a decision that altered the tempo of the entire Western Front. His call to seize, not observe, embodied the essence of battlefield initiative. His infantry surged through Remagen's ruined streets, supported by tanks and assault guns, while engineers followed close behind to disarm the explosives. The Germans, taken by surprise, fired from bunkers along the eastern bank. The air was alive with tracers and shrapnel, but the Americans moved with precision, leapfrogging from cover to cover, suppressing enemy fire with mounted .50 caliber guns. As they reached a bridge approach, the Germans triggered the charges. A column of flame erupted. The ground shook, but when the smoke cleared, the bridge still stood. In that moment, tactics became instinct. American squads rushed the span in small groups, crouched low as bullets sparked off the steel. Some crawled along the catwalks, others cut demolition wires with bayonets. Engineers tossed unexploded charges into the river. By the time dusk fell, U.S. forces had gained a bridgehead on the far bank. It was the most unexpected breakthrough of the Western campaign, a crossing achieved not by grand strategy, but by split-second human judgment. In war, sometimes the smallest decisions redraw entire maps. 3. The enemy angle. Panic on the east bank for the Germans. The sight of American armor crossing the Rhine was unthinkable. The Rhine was supposed to be Germany's unbreachable frontier, a line that would bleed any invader dry. The fact that it had been crossed intact, and so suddenly, sent shockwaves through every echelon of command. Captain Willy Bragg, who had failed to destroy the bridge, was immediately arrested and sent before a military tribunal. His superior Generalmajor Richard von Bothmer faced Hitler's direct fury. Within days, the Führer ordered a series of summary trials that led to the execution of several officers, including Major Hans Keller and Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, accused of cowardice and sabotage. To the German army, Remagen became a symbol of humiliation. The propaganda ministry could not hide it. Allied broadcasts made sure of that. News of the bridge's capture raced across Europe, spreading panic through already demoralized German ranks. If the Americans could cross the Rhine at Remagen, what else could they do? On the ground, the reaction was frantic. Artillery units near Bonn and Koblenz redirected their fire toward Luftwaffe squadrons were scrambled to bomb the bridge. Though by 1945, their fuel reserves were dwindling and their aircraft outmatched, Hitler even ordered the launch of V-2 rockets, weapons designed for cities, against the bridgehead. None hit their mark. But the psychological shock was immense. German field reports from March 9th to 11th describe chaotic countermeasures, with units thrown piecemeal against entrenched American positions. The once proud Wehrmacht was crumbling into disorder. Discipline gave way to desperation. And yet, even in that panic, there was grim admiration. Some German officers later admitted that the capture of the Ludendorff Bridge was a masterpiece of opportunity. They knew that if they had to possess the same daring initiative, the same refusal to wait for orders, history might have unfolded differently. As chaos engulfed both sides of the Rhine, the Ludendorff Bridge became more than a structure. It was a symbol of ingenuity, defiance, and the sudden turning of tides. But its transformation was only beginning, because what the American engineers would do next would turn the bridge from a captured prize into a weapon of war itself. Point 4. The human angle. Men against the river. The Ludendorff Bridge was not just a structure of iron and timber, it was a crucible for human endurance. The men who fought for and upon it were not grand strategists or war heroes. They were young, exhausted, and afraid. Yet, in those hours, they accomplished something that reshaped the war. Lieutenant Karl Timmermann was only 24 years old, the son of a German immigrant who had once fled the Kaiser's War. Standing on that bridge, staring into the smoke and chaos, he became the embodiment of fate's strange symmetry. He had crossed into the land his father left behind, not as a son returning home but as a liberator armed with conviction. The men of the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion spoke later of the surreal silence between bursts of gunfire, of the bridge trembling under their boots, of the sense that the Rhine itself wanted them gone. Some prayed as they crawled across steel beams slick with ice and blood. Others focused on their tools, their orders, their survival. One engineer later wrote, "We were afraid of two things, getting shot or stepping where the bridge didn't want you to step." The river claimed men even after the crossing. The wounded slipped from the structure into the icy current. Those who survived could never forget the sound, the creaking of steel over the river, like the breath of something alive when the last man made it across. No cheers erupted. There was only exhaustion, disbelief, and the cold understanding that they had just done the impossible. The bridge still stood, but for how long no one could say. 5. The technological angle, the bridge as a weapon. What followed was perhaps one of the most extraordinary feats of wartime engineering in modern history. The Ludendorff Bridge was collapsing. Every vibration from tanks or trucks sent shudders through its fractured frame. But instead of abandoning it, the U.S. Army engineers decided to use it not just as a passage, but as an instrument of control and deception. They began by converting its wreckage into a defensive system. The bridge's towers were fortified with machine guns and anti-aircraft emplacements. Damaged steel plates were repurposed as armor shields. Broken beams became barricades. The engineers turned the bridge into a deadly funnel. Any German counterattack that tried to retake it would face concentrated fire from both ends. Then came the tactical brilliance. The engineers intentionally left parts of the bridge unrepaired. Its twisted silhouette gave the impression of imminent collapse, dissuading German artillery from focusing on it directly. Many assumed it would fall on its own. Meanwhile, Allied convoys continued to cross by night, masked by smokescreens and false radio chatter. The bridge became a living deception. Its broken form served as camouflage, while its strength, constantly shored up by invisible hands, defied destruction. For 10 days, it remained operational, carrying thousands of soldiers and vehicles into the heart of Germany. When air raids intensified, the engineers went further. They rigged sections of the bridge with controlled charges so that, if collapse became inevitable, they could drop segments strategically to block the river channel, denying German boats or floating mines passage. In effect, the Ludendorff Bridge was no longer just a bridge. It had become a weaponized structure capable of both offense and defense. Both passage and denial. No other bridge in modern warfare had ever served such dual purpose. It was a testament to the adaptability of the human mind under fire, to the idea that even ruin can be turned into power when necessity demands it. 6. The leadership angle, decisions that redrew the map at the highest levels. The crossing at Remagen forced a shift in Allied strategy. The seizure of the bridge had been unplanned, but its consequences were immense. Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton all recognized the opportunity and the risk. Eisenhower, cautious yet pragmatic, saw Remagen as a chance to accelerate the end of the war. He immediately ordered reinforcements and engineers to exploit the bridgehead. In his headquarters journal, he described it as a gift from the gods of war, but one that must not be squandered. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, understood the symbolic weight. "We are across the Rhine," he said to his staff. "Now the enemy has no river left to hide behind." He pressed for rapid expansion of the bridgehead, knowing that morale and momentum now favored the Allies. And then there was George S. Patton, the fiery commander of the 3rd Army, operating further south. When he heard that the 9th Armored Division had crossed the Rhine before him, his pride flared. "Damn it, Bradley," he fumed. "They've beaten me to it." Yet even Patton acknowledged the brilliance of the engineers' work, later ordering his own crossings with similar aggressiveness. On the German side, Hitler's reaction bordered on the unhinged. He raged against his generals, demanded executions, and even considered personal intervention. But the truth was clear. Remagen had shattered not just a bridge, but a myth. The Rhine, the inviolable shield of Germany, was broken. In less than 48 hours, what had begun as an accidental discovery by an armored battalion became a turning point in the entire Western campaign. It was not merely a tactical victory, it was a psychological one, proof that ingenuity and courage could outpace the machinery of tyranny. The Ludendorff Bridge now stood at the center of a storm, battered by bombs, shaken by artillery, yet still alive. Its very survival had become an act of defiance. But the days ahead would test it beyond endurance, because soon, the bridge that had carried armies would face its final trial and, in its fall, to deliver its greatest blow of all. March 8, 1945. The sun rose over the Rhine like a wound reopening. The air reeked of burnt oil, cordite, and smoke. On the west bank, American engineers labored ceaselessly, reinforcing the Ludendorff Bridge with timber, iron, and prayer. On the east bank, infantry dug in, forming a precarious bridgehead against furious German counterattacks. The crossing at Remagen had been achieved, but holding it was another war entirely. The Germans responded with relentless precision. Artillery batteries near Erpelbonn and Königswinter rained shells onto the bridge. The Luftwaffe, reduced and desperate, began launching sorties from scattered airfields. Old Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 262 jets, some piloted by teenagers, swooped low over the Rhine, dropping bombs that detonated in the water or exploded harmlessly in the hills. The bridge trembled but did not break. Every hour, engineers patched what the enemy tore apart. They worked under sniper fire, welding beams, and tightening bolts as shrapnel screamed past their heads. At night, floodlights glared across the river, casting the twisted steel in ghostly silver. The bridge seemed to live, groaning, breathing, defying gravity and logic. By March 10th, the bridge had become more than an asset. It was the heart of the Allied advance. Nearly 25,000 men and 2,700 vehicles had crossed the Rhine, tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery, fuel convoys, all feeding into the new Eastern Front. The bridge was the artery that pumped the lifeblood of invasion into Germany. But the Germans were not done. On the morning of March 11th, Hitler issued Operation Sturmangriff, a full-scale assault to destroy the bridge at any cost. 11 Luftwaffe wings were ordered into the sky. Among them, the world's first operational jet bomber, the Arado AR-234 Blitz, made its combat debut. Sleek and fast, it dived at near-supersonic speeds toward the bridge. Releasing 500-kilogram bombs, they missed each explosion, churned the river into geysers, showering the bridge with debris but failing to bring it down. Allied anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts, bringing down several attackers. On the ground, the engineers cheered between clenched teeth, then went back to work. They had no illusions. Luck could not hold forever. Meanwhile, intelligence reports warned of something even more terrible. German long-range rocket units, previously used against London and Antwerp, had been ordered to target the Remagen bridgehead. Within days, the first V-2 rockets began falling near Remagen and Erpel, their sonic booms echoing like thunder from another world. These were terror weapons, not precision tools. Most missed by miles, exploding in forests and hillsides. But each strike reminded the engineers and infantry that they were standing beneath the crosshairs of history's most advanced and desperate arsenal. On March 13th, a near miss from a V-2 knocked men off their feet and cracked open the bridge's stone towers. The structure moaned, cables snapping like whips. The engineers scrambled, cutting away weakened sections, welding reinforcement plates, lashing steel girders together with cable. It was madness, engineering by instinct under fire. By this point, the Ludendorff was no longer a bridge. It was a battlefield. Its steel trusses bore the scars of artillery and air raids. Its deck was cratered, patched and rebuilt a dozen times, and yet it stood. That endurance became its weapon. The Germans threw everything they had left at Remagen: artillery, aircraft, even frogmen trained to plant underwater charges. Each failed attempt drained more of their strength. Each wasted shell, each lost aircraft, weakened the defense of the Rhine as a whole. The Americans began to realize something profound. The bridge's survival was bleeding the German army dry. Every resource diverted to destroy it was one less weapon defending Cologne. Koblenz or the Ruhr, the engineers, once working merely to preserve a crossing, now understood they were holding a trap, a magnet pulling in the enemy's final reserves. For 10 days, the ruined Ludendorff bridge became the focus of a nation's rage and a symbol of another's resolve. Newspapers back home called it the bridge that wouldn't die. Eisenhower himself visited the site on March 14th, walking across the trembling structure amid falling dust and rivets. He spoke briefly with the engineers and commanders, nodding at the chaos. "Keep it open," he said simply, before returning to his jeep. They did. The bridge continued to serve, each crossing a gamble. Every tank that rumbled across could be the one to break its back. Every gust of wind might be the last straw. And yet, men kept coming. Each footstep across that steel monster was an act of faith, not in luck, but in the stubborn courage of those holding it together. By March 15th, cracks spread through the central span. The steel frame bowed under the ceaseless weight. The engineers' faces were lined with fatigue. Their hands blistered raw. The Rhine below seemed to mock them. Dark, patient, waiting. The bridge had survived bombers, rockets, and sabotage. But now, it faced an enemy no one could fight. Exhaustion, the inevitable, was coming. March 17, 1945, 3 p.m. The sky over Remagen was low and colorless. A cold drizzle fell, hissing softly on the river. The Ludendorff bridge, that battered, blackened skeleton of steel, stood silent for a moment, as if it knew its time had come. For 10 days, it had carried the weight of 2 armies. It had survived more than 360 artillery shells, over 100 air raids, and the shockwaves of V-2 rocket strikes. But now, its wounds had become too deep to hide. The bridge's central arches sagged visibly. The decking trembled even under the lightest vehicle, bolts sheared from their sockets. Still, the engineers refused to abandon it. That morning, Lieutenant Colonel H.C. McMahon and his men had inspected the lower chords, the great steel beams forming the spine of the bridge. What they found chilled them. The entire central truss had twisted several inches out of alignment. Stress fractures spidered along the beams. Rivets popped audibly, one by one. It was a giant groaning under its own weight. McMahon ordered non-essential traffic halted. Only infantry on foot were allowed to cross. He ordered his engineers to string steel cables from bank to bank, hoping to brace the structure against collapse. They worked fast, but the Rhine was relentless, its current pulling, the wind pressing, the vibration of every tank across nearby pontoon bridges shaking the air. At 3 p.m., without warning, the inevitable happened. A sound like thunder cracked across the valley, a deep metallic roar that seemed to tear the sky apart. The Ludendorff Bridge shuddered once, then folded inward. Its massive steel frame buckled in slow, terrible motion, collapsing into the Rhine with a cascade of smoke and steam. Men on the bridge screamed warnings, leaping into the water as girders fell around them. The air filled with the shriek of tearing metal, the river boiling beneath as tons of iron plunged into it. When the dust cleared, the bridge was gone. Dozens of soldiers, engineers, infantry, medics were thrown into the Rhine. 28 were killed, many trapped beneath the collapsing structure. Survivors clung to floating debris, their faces pale with disbelief. For a moment, there was silence, a stunned quiet after days of thunder. Then, on both sides of the river, the realization sank in. The bridge that had defied the war had finally fallen, but the story did not end with its collapse. Even in ruin, the Ludendorff Bridge continued to serve a deadly purpose. Its twisted remains now choked the river, blocking German river traffic and forcing any potential crossings or counterattacks to detour miles downstream. The engineers' foresight, their placement of controlled charges and structural traps, had ensured that the fallen bridge would deny the enemy the same passage it had once offered. The Germans, unaware of the extent of the damage, continued to shell the wreckage for days afterward. Reports from captured German officers revealed confusion. Many believed the bridge was still standing, as American units kept their smoke screens active and continued ferrying troops by night. The deception worked. Even destroyed, the Ludendorff held the enemy's attention, drawing their fire and resources while the Allies advanced elsewhere. Meanwhile, just south of Rhine, American engineers completed the construction of 3 pontoon bridges within days, one heavy bridge for armor, another for infantry, and a third for supply convoys. What the Ludendorff had bought in those 10 days, a foothold across the Rhine, was now permanent. When Eisenhower received word of the collapse, his reaction was solemn. "We owe that bridge," he said, "and the men who held it, more than we can ever measure." To him, the Ludendorff was not just a structure, it was a symbol of how improvisation could outpace strategy, and how the courage of a few could change the course of many. The German command, on the other hand, fell deeper into despair. The failure to destroy the bridge in time had already led to the execution of 5 officers scapegoated by Hitler's fury. The news of its final collapse brought no relief. It was too late. By then, Allied forces were pouring into central Germany from multiple fronts. The bridgehead at Remagen had served its purpose within 3 weeks. The U.S. First Army linked with Patton's Third Army further south. The Rhine had been crossed in force, and Germany's western defenses were in total disarray. For the men who had worked on the bridge, the collapse was both tragedy and vindication. They mourned their comrades, yet understood what they had achieved. Their bridge had not failed, it had finished its duty. It had carried the war across the Rhine, and in dying, it had sealed the path behind them. A ruined bridge had become the blade that cut into the heart of the Reich. By dusk on that grey March day, the river carried away the last fragments of the Lud. Its iron bones sank into the dark water, where they would remain for decades, a monument not of destruction, but of defiance. And though it was gone, the bridge had already done what no weapon could. It had broken the spirit of a collapsing empire. The fall of the Ludendorff Bridge did not end the crossing, it solidified it by the time the bridge collapsed. On March 17, 1945, the Allied bridgehead at Remagen had expanded to over 7 miles deep and 10 miles wide. What began as an improvised seizure had transformed into a permanent gateway into the heart of Germany. The Rhine, that historic frontier that had shielded the German heartland for centuries, was no longer a barrier, it was a passage. Within 48 hours of the collapse, the U.S. Army engineers completed 3 floating pontoon bridges across the river near Rhine. These were built under constant shellfire and bombardment, often at night, using the glow of burning debris from the fallen bridge as illumination. The engineers, many from the 51st and 291st Engineer Combat Battalions, worked waist-deep in the freezing river, guided only by instinct and discipline. General William Hoge, commander of Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division, watched the progress with grim pride. "We lost the bridge," he said, "but not the crossing." His words captured the essence of what the engineers had achieved. They had turned disaster into continuity. Meanwhile, the Remagen bridgehead became a hub of movement and chaos. Armored columns thundered eastward through bombed villages and across makeshift roadways, heading toward Frankfurt, Kassel, and the Ruhr. Supply trucks rolled through day and night. Thousands of prisoners were taken as the German lines crumbled. The once impassable Rhine now saw an unbroken stream of Allied vehicles flowing across it, unstoppable. The capture and defense of the Ludendorff Bridge had also forced a dramatic realignment of Allied strategy. Originally, Operation Plunder, the main crossing of the Rhine, was planned for late March under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery in the north, but Remagen changed everything. Eisenhower no longer needed to wait. With American forces already on the eastern bank, the Allied timetable accelerated. The collapse of the Third Reich, once measured in months, was now a matter of weeks. For the German army, the psychological shock was devastating. That Rhine had been the last line of hope, the line Hitler had promised would never be crossed. Propaganda had called it the Wall of Europe, invincible under the protection of German engineering and willpower. The news that American soldiers and engineers had crossed it alive destroyed what little confidence remained in the Wehrmacht's ranks. Captured German soldiers spoke of disbelief and bitterness. One recalled, "We were told the Rhine was our salvation. When Remagen fell, we knew the war was lost." In Berlin, Hitler's rage turned to paranoia. He ordered the execution of every officer remotely connected to the Remagen defense. General Major Richard von Bothmer, Major Skeller, Lieutenant Peters, and several others were shot after brief sham trials. The bridge that had symbolized Allied ingenuity became, for the Germans, a monument to internal collapse, a mirror reflecting their own disintegration. For the Americans who had fought there, the aftermath was quieter but no less haunting. The surviving engineers of the 299th Engineer Battalion and the 9th Armored Division were commended for heroism. Lieutenant Karl Timmerman, who had led the initial crossing, received the Distinguished Service Cross. Many others received Silver Stars, Bronze Stars, and Purple Hearts. Yet the men spoke little of medals. They remembered the faces of those who had fallen when the bridge went down in military history. Few structures have carried such symbolic weight. The Ludendorff Bridge was not merely a tactical asset, it was an event. Its survival defied logic. Its fall fulfilled destiny. For 10 days it had carried the hopes of armies across steel and smoke, and when it finally gave way, it had already delivered victory. The Rhine's dark waters swallowed the bridge's remains, but not its legacy. The engineers continued to work, turning destruction into design, ruin into road. Each plank laid across the new pontoon bridges was a continuation of the same idea that ingenuity could triumph over chaos, that courage could build where war sought only to destroy the crossing it. Remagen had changed everything, but its consequences were only beginning to unfold. The collapse of the Ludendorff Bridge marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Its destruction did not hinder the Allied advance. It ignited it. In the weeks that followed, American forces surged eastward from the Remagen bridgehead, cutting deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. By late March 1945, the U.S. First Army had linked up with Patton's Third Army, closing the trap around the industrial Ruhr Valley, Germany's last major source of coal and armaments. What had begun as a spontaneous act of initiative at Remagen evolved into a campaign of encirclement. More than 300,000 German troops were soon trapped and captured in the Ruhr pocket. An entire army group swallowed in one of the largest surrenders of the war. Eisenhower later reflected, Remagen shortened the war by months, perhaps by more. Historians would agree, the bridge had not just given the Allies a foothold, it had broken the rhythm of the German defense. No longer could the Wehrmacht retreat in organized fashion. Every withdrawal became a rout. Every delay meant collapse. The psychological impact was immense. Allied troops, long wearied by winter battles, suddenly felt unstoppable. The impossible had been achieved. The myth of the Rhine was gone. Soldiers who had once spoken of getting home by Christmas now spoke of ending it by Easter. The engineering lessons were equally profound. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers studied the Remagen operation meticulously, treating it as a case study in improvisation under fire. The reports highlighted the critical importance of field engineering, the ability to adapt, innovate, and build under combat pressure. Manuals later issued to combat engineers around the world would cite Remagen as an example of how initiative and technical skill could turn disaster into triumph. In peacetime, the lessons of the Ludendorff Bridge reshaped how armies thought about infrastructure and war. Bridges were no longer viewed merely as static crossings but as tactical instruments, structures that could be seized, rebuilt, or weaponized to serve shifting objectives. The term engineer warfare gained new prominence, acknowledging that victory often hinged not only on who could destroy, but who could rebuild faster. As for Remagen itself, the town lay in ruins. Its streets were shattered by shellfire, its hills scarred by craters. Yet amid the wreckage, life resumed. When the war ended weeks later, American soldiers helped the townspeople clear debris. The remnants of the Ludendorff Bridge still jutted from the Rhine like ribs of a fallen giant. For years, they stood as a ghostly monument to those who had crossed and those who had died in 1958. The remaining towers were preserved as memorials. On the western bank, the stone fortress that once guarded the bridge's approach was transformed into a peace museum, dedicated to reconciliation. Inside its cool chambers, visitors could see photographs of the crossing, fragments of twisted steel, and personal letters from soldiers who had fought there. One inscription reads, "We built so that others could cross. We crossed so that others could build." It was a fitting epitaph for the men of the 299th Engineers, the 9th Armored Division, and the countless others who risked everything on that trembling span. Even in its destruction, the Ludendorff Bridge carried meaning. It reminded the world that ingenuity and courage are often born from desperation, that even in war's darkest hours, creation can emerge from collapse. By the time Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, the Rhine had long ceased to be a barrier. It had become a memory, a river that once divided nations and now united them in the ruins of peace. The men who crossed at Remagen returned home months later, many too humble to speak of what they'd done. Yet in the annals of World War II, their crossing stands as one of those rare moments when fate or engineering and raw human will converged into history. The Ludendorff Bridge did not just change a campaign, it changed how the world understood the power of human ingenuity to take something broken and make it unstoppable. The Rhine has always divided Europe, a river of legend, poetry, and blood. But in March 1945, at Remagen, it became something else entirely, a bridge between the old world and the new. The Ludendorff Bridge's story is not one of luck or chance. It is the story of human resolve under impossible conditions, of men who looked at destruction and chose to build anyway. They did not see a ruin, they saw possibility. And in that vision they turned a collapsing structure into a symbol of endurance for 10 days. The bridge at Remagen embodied the paradox of war, creation born from devastation. Every rivet tightened under fire, every beam secured amid chaos, was an act of defiance against entropy itself. It was the quiet courage of engineers, the kind that rarely makes headlines, that turned the tide of history. When the bridge finally fell, it did not fail. It fulfilled its purpose. It carried an army across a river once thought impassable, then sealed itself behind them. Its death was not loss but completion, the closing of one chapter of war and the opening of another, leading toward peace. In the years that followed, the name Remagen became more than a place. It became a metaphor for turning weakness into strength, ruin into resistance. Soldiers, historians, and engineers would remember it not as the day a bridge fell, but as the day American ingenuity turned a ruin into a weapon. The Rhine flowed on, silent witness to the fleeting nature of war and the enduring mark of human hands. The steel may have rusted, the towers may stand empty, but the idea remains that in the darkest hours, the builders of bridges can change the course of nations in the end. The Ludendorff Bridge did more than carry men across a river. It carried civilization from the chaos of destruction toward the fragile promise of reconstruction, and it did so, for one brief moment in history, with the strength of a single, ruined bridge.